the topic I had in mind was to really talk about the experience of design through stages of the game's own development.
Yes.
I know as well that you wanted to talk about setting as an engine feature of play,
Right.
if I understand correctly.
Yeah.
So let's take it to whichever of those you want to address. We want to start with yours.
Sure. I should reread the setting now essay and probably come up with some specific questions, but I would be very excited to talk about it in general.
So you're talking about setting an emergent story, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I read setting now and it really inspired me in a lot of ways. The thinking of how like setting could be an integral part of a system and like the ways and the ways that interacting with the setting could be one of the things that changes the fiction in really exciting ways for the players. And I'm working on a game right now where I think that would be really integral to the experience.
Excellent. I should point out the subtle ways in which a setting is established to occur through the application of game mechanics. A very good example is when fantasy games that assigned you starting funds as a player to purchase the things for your character, when they shifted from everybody getting a fixed amount, regardless of the nature of the character, they shifted into a character type basis for how much money you got. If you were a fighter, you rolled this many dice for your gold coins. If you were a wizard, you rolled this many dice for your gold coins.
Right.
One could point out to the requisite resources for the different classes and say that it was a scaling effect to keep the wizard from wandering around with all this pocket change, which the wise player would simply give to their fighter buddy so that the fighter gets basically, a double dose or something like that. But the idea was expanded upon in ways that can't be described like that when people started talking about what kind of job your starting character has and therefore how much money they are going to have on them when play begins. So do you see that although in such a game you might not even describe the setting at all, but this game mechanic that assigns you money based on what kind of character you are presupposes some kind of setting in which those dynamics are going to be at work. Some sort of labor theory of value is, in application somewhere for this to happen. So I guess what I'm saying is that it really doesn't take much to get a sense of setting into place. So that's just sort of the first notion, is that it is not laborious and there is no minimum number of words describing setting that begins at 000 for you to have one.
Right.
So just to sort of start that off, first of all. Okay. So one of the principles in that essay that I think is the strongest is that we're talking about a way to play which uses a small location rather than the entirety of the location for play. Instead of looking at the enormous fantasy map and saying, well, during the course of the campaign, I guess we're going to hit every single province here.
Right.
And thinking, okay, that's my job. We are now going to visit every damn spot. Just like those tedious fantasy novels from the 80s where you open up the book and then the first couple pages is this elaborate map and you just know that by the time you get to the end of the book, they would have visited every fucking spot with a name. So
Tolkien did it.
Anyway, so instead of thinking of your fantasy campaign in that regard, instead, this is where I got my logic that I later would describe in Circle of Hens, which is that you're really just prepping and concerning yourself with situational locations. And you draw upon aspects of the more general setting, but they don't really become experiential until people encounter them in this situation. So, is that, I mean, I don't think the way we've talked in the past, that didn't seem to me like you were having much trouble with that idea.
No, I'm comfortable with the idea. I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on like to what degree you can. So let me describe what I'm interested in, and then you can tell me if like this is something that should be left sort of squishy and soft, or if it's worth having mechanical in some sense. So I'm making a game where it's a superhero game where the character's ethics is what drives what they can do. So where they fall on certain ethical binaries are basically their attributes, and it's all about like, it's not about having superpowers and beating up robbers. It's about what do you do given what you believe when you're given power. And so a thing that I'm really interested in is having that sort of tight location with, you know, the game master or storyteller or whatever prepping situation, and then giving the players maybe a mechanical way, even if it's not like super crunchy, to dictate the effects given their ethical frameworks on the broader setting, you know. So, you know, people in New York love Spider-Man, that sort of thing. Like, what happens as a result of what they believe and what they do about it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, although you've thrown a lot of variables into the mix pretty quickly. Yeah. One of the first things I'll say is that the framework that you talked about for building the characters and the questions that you feel are inherent to playing a character implies to me that the situations they face will act as stressors or as contexts for those values to actually be relevant in the first place.
Yes.
So, number one. Number two, that you, I guess in a lot of ways, I'm saying that even if you were to take a completely canonical setting superhero game, let's say one from the 90s, I can think of a couple, and it has its super city. It has its backstory that's carefully detailed decade by decade, even year by year in the book. It's got its, you know, the majority of superpower characters are already there for you to simply pick up and use from their various supplements and things.
Right.
You know, it's established that the mayor of New York is actually, you know, an alien who's been living there for, you know, 100 years and loves New York, right? So you've got all that, you know, in the book. Right. And you could even back it up that there's a looser history or a slightly sketchier history that pertains to the whole world. And then you also have sort of a cosmological context as well, so that certain dimensions are now available and detailed in a supplement of their own, including perhaps rules for building a superhero who hails from one of those.
Right.
You're imagining this game that I just made up, you know, already and easily. Yeah. And in fact, we could take, you know, what was it? Trinity, Eon, or Eon Trinity, whichever one it was. Aberrant. And, beg your pardon?
Aberrant, I believe, was the
Aberrant,
one.
Yes. Aberrant, and then there was Nemesis, another game. The short-lived Champions experiment with Altar Saurian called Fusion. All of them were built more or less on this model. Yeah. So, and there are others too. I mean, Silver Age Sentinels a little bit later. Just basically, It's the same idea. Okay, so we've got this. And I would venture to say that even in a game which physically presents like this, you're still doing the same thing. The characters can only operate in the sphere of the situation that they encounter or feed into during play anyway.
Right.
So it's as far as play itself is concerned, there's not that much different. They
Right.
are still simply encountering the situations they encounter and operating however it is that the procedures of play allow them to operate, and having whatever impacts they're going to have on the setting that makes sense to who's ever in charge of the setting.
Right.
Um, and I think that, therefore, the question is not how is playing different, because it's more a matter of how is play presented as a book,
Mhm.
and also how is play processed in terms of the participants. The actual fictional content really isn't very different. So that's a kind of a first point.
Yeah.
So are you asking about what should be presented so that people can play the game successfully? So how do they interact with the text? Or are you
Mhm.
talking more about literal procedures or principles by which they're operating when they do it?
I think what I'm talking about is that I think that there will be good activity loops that fulfill the promise of the game in session. What I'm kind of interested in is building a broader change in the setting that the players have some narrative control over as part of the reward cycle.
Sure. And
The
you're not
reward
the
cycle.
first, to propose that. That's not a bad thing. It's fun. I would suggest that what we're talking about is what I was talking about last time, is that through the experience of situations and having those locations change, you can now paint different stuff on the backdrop too. So that in the backdrop you could have, for example, the populace distrusts masked superheroes. Well, your character, through the virtues of their behavior and the outcomes in play, and the way that the player chooses to affect the setting, can now paint on the backdrop that the public is more favorably disposed, at the very least toward their own hero and perhaps toward their friends.
Right.
So therefore, the backdrop of the setting has changed. They haven't talked about anyone specific, and they haven't limited it to just the characters in this one location that they were at either.
Right.
So that's really not too hard. What they're changing is not any specific one feature, like, okay, that building has been destroyed, or anything really highly specific. They've changed something that the from now on can be drawn upon as a feature of the setting for the
Right.
construction of further situations. Does that? So, but it
Yeah.
doesn't really seem like it's all that difficult to implement. Um, Certainly, the proper phrasing for how you want people to be able to do it
Yeah.
matters, but the basic principle is pretty basic. It's pretty easy.